Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I will give you is light." This passage is taken from a discourse where Jesus responds to the criticism of the religious leadership of his day by extending an invitation to the people that they neglected and looked down upon to participate in something new and innovative. Consider this passage in the 11th chapter in concert with Jesus' commentary on the religious system of his day in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, 'The teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey what they tell you, but don't follow their example. For they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease that burden.'" So we have two passages, one where Jesus offers rest and another where Jesus talks about the burden that's being placed on people by the religious community of his day. Trying to gain acceptance of the religious community in Jesus' day was an arduous process. The task went far beyond just adhering to the written Mosaic law. In addition, there was the oral tradition of the rabbis, which was extensive, convoluted, and in that culture just as much, if not more, of an authority than text has in today's society. A book that I'm reading is called The Lost World of the Ancient Scripture. It's written by John Walton. And he talks about, in that book, the fact, he introduces a phrase called oral text, O-R-A-L text. That seems contradictory to us because what's oral is spoken and text is what's written down. Back then, in the biblical days, from Genesis all the way through, the majority of the society was not a literate society. It may have been able to read some, but it wasn't functionally literate and it wasn't able to write very well. For them, oral tradition and what was spoken that could be traced back to an authority figure carried every bit as much weight as books do to us. You know, we've got the Constitution written. That's what's written. That's what we're supposed to follow. They couldn't necessarily read it. It didn't necessarily matter what was written down. If they could trace the oral tradition back to an authority figure, and without getting too far into the book, it deals with what it meant to be an authority. There was a specific individual that was authority. Then there were traitors who were authorized to take what was given from the authority and pass it along verbally to other people. And then as those traitors continued to pass it down, eventually it trickled its way down to scribes who would write it down and stick it somewhere, but nobody could really read it. So it still went with the authority. And really the book deals with inerrancy of Scripture, and I'm not going to get off on a tangent, but it deals with how we look at inerrancy. The idea that the words don't have to be exactly what they were then. They didn't care about that. The question was, whose authority are they representing when they pass this on? So in the days of Jesus, you had the Mosaic law. Then you also had a series of case laws, we would consider it. Case law, rulings, verdicts, edicts, that were passed along orally that carried every bit as much weight to that society as the Mosaic law did. Now, realistically, it didn't carry as much weight, and that's one of the reasons that Jesus butted heads with people. But they had this entire litany of oral traditions and practices that were being taught that carried weight and loaded people down. Consider, if you will, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. I don't know how you feel about the IRS, but I'm not that crazy about them. And imagine if not only could the IRS exact taxes from people's pockets, but also claimed authority over their souls. Now consider how complicated the federal tax code is, and imagine what the federal spiritual code might look like. Stretch that out over centuries of development. Toss in the fact that abject poverty was almost universal to the Judeans, and therein you will find an inkling of what the men and women of Jesus' day lived in under their spiritual communities. So, the tax laws are that long and they can't have follow them themselves except for when it comes time to audit you, and then they know exactly what it's supposed to say. And if they had a spiritual code, it would be twice as big and even more convoluted. Being found acceptable by that religious establishment was a burdensome process. The imagery that's evoked in the 23rd chapter of Matthew is lost to modern culture, but recaptured by Johnson and Vondervan in The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, that 23rd chapter passage that we read about laying crushed people with unbearable religious demands. It's the King James text says that they heap burdens upon men, but will do nothing to help them carry it. What Johnson and Vondervan explain is that the first century version of a four-wheel drive truck was a poor beast of burden known as the donkey. The primary function of a donkey was to carry things. A common practice in Palestine at the time of Christ was to load these animals with so many goods that you could not see the animal that disappeared under the load of the burden of what it had to carry. Many a person have disappeared under the weight of spiritually abusive communities. In fact, it is often the aim of these communities to make an individual disappear under the mountain of practices, pronouncements, precepts, and traditions that they ascribe. Jesus' call to discipleship in the 11th chapter of Matthew comes with an offer of rest, light burdens, and an easy yoke. Jesus came in some respects to simplify the tax code.